So, fossorial water vole training. As I said, I've introduced myself, Diane Lyons of Starling Learning, and thank you very much for having me today. So, one moment. Let me go. So, what we're going to cover today in this course, we're going to cover the, I'm just going to close this down because it's obscuring my screen. There we go. Sorry. We are going to cover the current status of fossorial water voles in Glasgow, why monitoring water voles is key to their conservation, and where to find them and what to look out for when you are conducting your survey work. So what is it that makes Glasgow's fossorial water voles a really significant and important population? Water voles have been in Glasgow since records began, but it wasn't until 2008 that the fossorial water vole was identified here in Glasgow. Now, fossorial just means adapted for digging, like a mole, for example. But another word that's been used to describe them quite frequently is a grassland water vole, which I think is quite an accessible way of explaining them to people, because when we say fossorial water vole, the first thing people say is, well, what does fossorial mean? But a grassland water vole is just basically a water vole existing away from water. And this is something else that makes it a significant population, because it's an unusual behaviour. So fossorial water voles and water voles live side by side, and there's a bit of interplay between the species. But as I say, they were identified first in Glasgow by a pest controller in 2008, who accidentally caught one in a rat trap and was able to identify it as a water vole, but was kind of perplexed as to what it was doing so far away from water. Wetland water voles tend to venture no further than 2 meters away from a watercourse or a canal or a wet flusher, for example, but these water voles, the grassland water voles, can be found up to 1,800 meters away from water. So the thing that makes them fossorial is their habit of spending most of their time underground, and they are adapted for digging and produce what's known as tumuli, or it looks a bit like a molehill, a kind of flattened molehill. And after they were first identified in Glasgow in 2008, there was further survey work done to discover that there was a large and established population in Glasgow's East End and in North Lanarkshire. Excuse me 1 second, I'm just going to change this screen view slightly. There we go. So as I say, there's a large population in the East End of Glasgow and heading up to North Lanarkshire. And like all water voles, and in the rest of the UK and in Scotland, there are species that are in serious decline. They've declined by up to 90% sort of over the last 50 years, for example. Like a lot of water voles across the UK, they went into decline as a result of urbanisation, but further pressures from the predation from American mink, for example, has caused their population to crash even further, which gives added significance to the population that we have here. So like all water voles across the UK, they are in fact a protected species. So the legislation protecting the water voles is the Wildlife and Countryside Act, amended in 1981, and it states quite clearly that it is illegal to, to destroy or obstruct access to a water vole burrow and or place of shelter, to disturb a water vole while it's occupying its burrow and or its place of shelter. Now you can see, and this is quite a common theme in the Wildlife and Countryside Act, is that it's the actual dwelling of the creature that's protected and not the creature itself. So methodology has been developed to survey water voles to adhere to this level of protection that they have, and to try and minimise disturbance. The methodology was developed from a book called the Water Vole Mitigation Handbook, and has been further distilled into a specific set of guidelines in relation to the surveying of fossorial water voles. So I'm just going to talk to you briefly about the survey that we've been carrying out on behalf of the Seven Lochs Project. Now, you can survey to any level that you want. I mean, casual records are really vital, so any sighting that you make and any kind of record that you can make is important, but I just thought I'd talk you quickly sort of through the methodology that we used and are using in our current survey. So the first thing that we would do is do a desktop survey to gather all existing data. and collect all the current and up-to-date data of the site during a field study as well. And that's usually carried out by 2 people. The reason it's 2 people is actually because it's a kind of health and safety thing, because it's an urban site. 2 of you have to stay together, distancing yourself about 5 metres apart and crossing the various sites in a transect, looking for field signs, burrows, latrines, runs, feeding remains, and tumuli, which is such a strange word. Tumulus is the singular, tumuli is the plural, and that's just the word for the wee pile of soil that they leave behind. And once we've conducted the survey, what we have to do is produce a report with maps to show the current presence or absence at different locations and their distribution. So there tends to be 2 clusters of visits. You'll get 2 visits together, sort of April, May time, and then we do another 2 visits in June and July. This is because the activity significantly increases in this period, so you can get a much fuller picture of what's going on. So I've just taken this little bit out of our report just to show you this bit at the bottom, if I can move the arrow specifically. This link at the bottom here is the current guidelines that are being used to survey fossorial water voles. And as you can see, it's emphasised again in our method statement that as water vole burrow systems can be quite shallow, great care has to be taken around the burrow entrances to avoid damage, and that's always worth keeping in mind, of course, when you're doing survey work for fossorial water voles, because as you'll discover, they are so abundant in some sites that you're literally walking over the top of their homes. So monitoring this population is absolutely key to their future conservation. This individual in the picture here, this wee guy, is being translocated to a different site. This wasn't carried out by us, but would have been carried out by an ecologist under a special licence. So it turns out that Pringle cans are absolutely a fantastic way to trap and translocate fossorial water voles and other water voles as well, I presume. So the reason it's really important to monitor this population is because they are at serious risk from local extinction through habitat loss and fragmentation, which, as we know, is a threat to a lot of our wildlife. Is this kind of breaking up, fragmentation of habitats. You lose the connectivity and species lose the ability to distribute and to remain a genetically viable, healthy population. So monitoring this population is so important to maintain the existing habitats and also to identify sites to which they can be translocated, because they are, the East End of Glasgow is undergoing, huge redevelopment. And there's a kind of irony in that, because fossorial water voles are very drawn to where people are, because where people are and where development is, it creates the kind of habitat that they like. So you're going to get brownfield sites, long grassland, parks, road verges, and all the places where they tend to thrive. So as I say, this monitoring is really crucial, that development can carry on in a way that does not impact too heavily on the population, and we can mitigate against it. And also helps us to identify suitable areas for new grassland creation. Although there are some amazing opportunities for the water voles to disperse at the moment across the Seven Lochs Project, in particular at like Blair Tummock Park, for example, which has been specifically created to encourage the fossorial water voles, and they're actually just kind of heading out along the M8 as their dispersal route, and along the Clyde walkway. In fact, if you go into North Lanarkshire now, it is now a requirement for any developer to survey for fossorial water voles. Fossorial water voles, it's such a mouthful, but that's what has been asked of any developer now. It's quite interesting that the East End has become a stronghold for them. There's lots of factors that are in play, but it's been a heavily industrialised area, and historically over the last kind of maybe 3 to 4 decades, regeneration in this area has been slower. But with that regeneration comes a lot of brownfield sites and development, which, as I say, is something that these little blighters actually really like. So moving on to the next slide. So I've put together a wee calendar of kind of what is going on with the water voles all through the year, because I think that's really important to understanding the field signs that you happen to find. If you understand the ecology of them, then you can interpret the field signs that you're seeing and better understand them, and just kind of basically know what to expect. So this little guy sticking his head out of his wee nose out of the snow there is to indicate that it is winter. So December to February, we've got an overwintering behaviour. Now, they don't hibernate, but they do spend the vast majority of their time subterraneously beneath the ground, staying warm and feeding on their cached food stores, although they will put their heads above ground when it's warm enough. Like even species that do technically hibernate, like bats, you know, are known to come out for a wee fly around and a little snack if the weather permits. I have been known to stoat down the stairs myself in the middle of the night for a fried egg piece, so it's just something that people do. But in the winter time, burrows tend to appear dormant with little or no activity at this time of year. So March to September, this is when the burrows start to become active again. They're emerging from this period of dormancy, and as we move through March through towards September, you know, particularly through the end of May into June, then the breeding season really gets into full swing. It's the females of the breed that are territorial, so they set up these little their burrow systems, and that's where they will raise their young. Several broods can be born throughout the year, and it's at this time of year when you can see the young start to disperse, and you can see lots of tumuli, lots of digging, lots of runs and stuff like that. So it can be the most, it's obviously the most significant time of year to capture any field signs. Yeah, so they spend most of their time feeding, because water voles have to eat about 80% of their own body weight every day, and they obviously need to be in really healthy condition going into the period of dormancy over winter. So October to November is what it's all about, is preparing for winter, getting the burrows all ready. It's quite interesting. There's been some studies done to compare what a fossorial water vole's burrow system is like in comparison to a wetland water vole, and they're slightly different in structure in that they've got a central nest in the centre of the burrow with chambers with little runs and tunnels in between them, and within the chambers you will have a chamber for sleeping, there'll be a chamber that's got latrine, there'll be a chamber that's got cached food stores. So they're quite fastidious little creatures. So October to November is when they're getting themselves all ready and stockpiling to get them through that phase. It's also a time of year when population numbers can drop quite considerably as food becomes scarcer and temperatures start to drop. And I think obviously because they're living in such high densities, I think the population for territory the intensity of that must add to that kind of drop off in population. However, that is the strategy of a prolific breeder. You know, it's a numbers game, and there are going to be periods throughout the year where their population peaks and then it crashes. So next slide. So this is about where to find them. And if you're living in the East End of Glasgow, it can be anywhere. It can be on a roundabout, it can be in a cemetery, it's at the Fort shopping centre where people apparently feed them biscuits, it's in people's gardens, as some of our participants have shared with us today. But they tend to prefer, their preference is an area with long vegetation, the long vegetation providing really good cover for them, but you can get them in really short grass as well. They like a soil that's easy to excavate, that's easy to extend their burrow systems, because water voles are they live in what we call a meta population, which means that they move within patches of habitat. In fact, they reckon that the grassland water vole can move up to an average of about 75 metres from their burrow. So you can imagine with the numbers that we're talking about, that's quite a large area for dispersal. And where they are in short grass, they're still present, but they just spend more time underground to protect them from predation. The things that they're most likely to be predated by is foxes, domestic dogs, gulls, and members of the corvid family, crows, magpies, etc. So derelict sites, road verges, brownfield sites, you'll find them under porta cabins, you'll find them under pallets. They particularly like disused blaze football pitches. The structure of that, the sort of is just ideal for digging, and it can be a really good place to watch their activity. But like I said, you can get them in the tiniest little spaces. Their territory compared to a wetland water vole, I believe, has got a territory for between 30 and 150 metres along a sort of linear stretch of bank, whereas I keep calling them terrestrial water voles, they're not, they are fossorial water voles, apologies again, grassland water voles, their territory is like 8 to 10 meters, so they live in much higher densities. They like a tussocky forming grass, or a grass that grows up and then falls in on top of itself and kind of forms these kind of sort of bumfles or cushions, if you like, which are really, really good for burrowing in. But they like that also in association with tall vegetation like creeping thistle and ragwort, which are really good for like for cover for when you're feeding and dispersing and trying to keep your head down when Mr. Fox comes through. So I've included these two maps here because these are two places that you can go to where you will definitely be able to hone your field skills. On the left here at Croynia Park, I hope I'm saying that correctly. You can see on the map here, every one of these compartments that is numbered is an area that we have and will be specifically surveying. So we'll visit every one of these compartments and carry out the transect surveys, record all the field signs, and then produce a summary and maps for every one of these compartments. And this down here, this is the motorway. So you can see there's a real physical barrier here, but this is also the Clyde walkway here. So they are just whoosh, dispersing up and down the Clyde, the M8 basically. But there is a real physical barrier here, although they are starting to pop up in other places. A colleague of mine who's doing a breeding bird survey over in Lennoxtown has found signs of them there. So they're definitely starting to make their presence felt elsewhere. The place on the right-hand side, I've put this up, this is part of Blair Tummock Park. In the foreground here, you can see that kind of classic tall vegetation that I was talking about, which they really like. But beyond that, up towards these buildings where the sward is quite short, they're also here in great numbers. And it's a really good place to go and have a look at them, although you do tend to attract quite a lot of attention to yourself. So be prepared to answer questions from curious passerbys, some who are in favour of water voles and some who are not particularly. So I'm just going to move on to this slide here. So the field signs, I've not listed all the field signs because there's quite a few, and if you want to discover what all the field signs are and record your field signs to the level where you're using the correct notation and stuff, you can refer back to that email link that I had put on the third slide, I think, where it's the email link to the most up-to-date methodology if you want to record them in that level of detail. But I've just got some pictures here to kind of give you an idea of what to look for. So here is the famous tumuli. So it's the soil that is produced from digging. And where the ground isn't particularly deep, there's sort of optimum depth for the Fossorial water vole is about 50 centimetres, but where the soil isn't that deep, these soil mounds can actually contain chambers. So they could have like food chambers or nesting chambers in them, so you do have to kind of take care. They look, like I say, as a flattened off molehill, and they tend to be located next to burrow entrances. Now, if you're ever standing and thinking, oh, is this a molehill? Is this a vole hill? Then generally moles tend to create their hills in a sort of linear pattern, whereas the voles, the Fossorial water vole, tend to create their tumuli or their soil piles in a cluster. So that can be another way to indicate, to show you that that's actually what you're looking at. And this is a really obvious sign to see during spring and summer because of the high levels of activity, although they do persist in the environment. In fact, when you're walking, especially when you do a survey in early spring, when you're walking across an area, you can kind of feel the tumuli under your feet, especially when the grass has grown up over them. So you'd end up kind of sensing where they are beneath your feet. So this is another picture of some tumuli. There's fantastic burrow entrance there, really well-defined burrow entrance. And you can see the amount of tumuli here. In fact, if you look across this picture, there's some more there, there's some there, there's some there. So they're a really distinctive field sign to look out for. And once you get your eye in for them, you see it everywhere. So burrows and burrow entrances and runs. These, again, like I said, will be close to the tumuli, can be often quite close to it, and you tend to get more than one burrow entrance. So burrow excavation is going on all the time, and they will abandon a burrow, they will return to that burrow, re-excavate it. They'll sometimes block the burrow entrances up with vegetation if there's been lots of rainfall or some kind of disturbance. So there's not a direct line of correlation sometimes between the amount of burrowing that you see and the number of individuals, but it's just because, like I was explaining, like the way that they actually use their habitat can just lead to this, I'm trying to think of the right word, but this kind of network, kind of web of burrows underneath the soil. It can also be an opportunity when you're looking at the burrows, you can sometimes see quite clearly predation from foxes and dogs where they've been digging out the burrows. So they're sort of 4 to 8 centimetres in diameter, and also in the breeding season you get this really cute little grazed lawn around the entrance, as I can show you in this next picture a bit more clearly. So we've got long grass and short grass here, but if you look here you can see where the grass is shorter around the burrow entrance. The same here, the grass is slightly shorter, and this is when the female has got young in the burrow and she doesn't want to have to go too far for her dinner basically, so she just eats everything that's within reach to sort of minimize the amount of time that she's having to spend away from the burrow and away from the young. But you can just see, I mean, look at that, how short that is, how short that grass is, right next to a path. People, Asda, you know, they don't care, and they're quite drawn to us and all our development. Apologies for this photo being a bit blurry, but it's just, I just think it shows you the runs just so clearly. I mean, it's like a little motorway there, isn't it? It's like Spaghetti Junction. You can see all the different highways and byways there. So that's another field sign that you can look out for. Move on to the next slide. Feeding remains. Now, when you read the books about how voles are supposed to behave, it says, you know, field vole feeding remains tend to be shorter, water vole feeding remains tend to be longer. But to be honest, they don't stick to the rules, so they can vary enormously in length. But if you find a feeding remain that's been chewed at a 45-degree angle, that definitely indicates that it has been eaten by a vole. And then what you would do is put those field signs together with other field signs to establish whether it was a field vole or a field vole or a fossorial water vole. I'm going to have a drink at this point, excuse me. Thirsty work saying fossorial water vole over and over again. So the feeding remains can be found along the runs, can be found next to the vegetation itself that they're feeding from. It can be found next to the burrows. A lot of that food is getting taken down below to be stored over winter and used for bedding. And what they tend to do is, as they're eating, you know, they discard the leftovers, so they make these nice little piles. Probably one of the slightly more challenging field signs to identify, but as I say, once you get your eye in, I think it's almost like sort of laying down the neural pathway. Once you've done it enough times, like your eye's just drawn to things. I have a colleague, Alan, who is like an expert at finding nests. You think finding nests would be quite simple, but it's not. It's really tricky. But he's been doing it since he was a kid, so he has got this knack of doing it. And I think it's like all these things, the more you practice, the more embedded it becomes, and the more you learn to trust your instincts and your intuition. Although what we would always say with a protected species like this is you always err on the side of caution. So even if you're not sure, but you think it could be, then you always, you know, on the side of the protected species, and you say, yes, well, it definitely is. Always better to err on the side of caution, even if you don't have 100% of the information at the time to give a positive confirmation. You should always err on the side of caution. So these are some of the plants that are associated with grassland water voles. The red fescue, the Yorkshire fog and the colt's foot are all of the grasses that they tend to like. And the soft rush and the creeping thistle are some examples of the tall vegetation, which again offer them a kind of advantage in their habitat if they've got kind of long vegetation to hide in. I've got a couple of pictures here of the red fescue on the left. The Yorkshire fog on the right is that lovely kind of classic soft glaucous green grass, which is very tasty. And sweet vernal grass, that's another one that they like. So latrines and droppings. Now, the dropping of water voles, both wetland and fossorial, is a real indicative field sign. They are bigger than field voles droppings. They're about the size and shape of a tic tac, different in coloration depending on how fresh they are. You can see them throughout the year, but during the breeding season is when you're most likely to see them, because this is when latrines are active. Now, latrines are used across the animal kingdom as just basically an information post. So it's an accumulation of droppings, and it's for communication, not only to demark sort of territorial boundaries, but also between males and females during the breeding season. And they're quite often next to the entrances to their burrows, so they can be quite easy to spot. Again, a really good sign during the breeding season. I've got some better pictures of them for you here. A close-up view, look at that. So on the left-hand side here, you can see there's like an accumulation of droppings. And in fact, water voles do a thing called puddling, where they will defecate and then puddle, put their feet into it to carry the scent across their territory. That is probably, I don't know how significant that is for fossorial water voles as compared to wetland water voles, where their territories have probably got more of a demarcation. Fossorial water voles live in such high numbers that you quite often get adults sharing the same burrow system. The picture on the right hand side here, you can see that very distinctive kind of tic-tac shape. So, reporting your findings, and if you guys are going out as a group of volunteers, then I'm sure you will be reporting your findings in quite a formal way and recording your findings in quite a formal way. But any kind of casual record is really important, and I've put a list up here of people who you can send your records to. And if you've got any other questions or you'd like any more information about what we've talked about today, I've also put the email address, Starling Learning's email address down there if you want to ask some more in-depth questions or something that perhaps doesn't get covered today. But as I say, casual records are vital too. So if you train yourself up, train your friends up, even just in a casual way, train your pals and your family to identify some tumuli, and before you know it, everyone will be out like dropping a wee pin on their phone, getting a GPS reading, and hopefully submitting their records. That is one of the things that I think is so amazing about the fossorial water vole population, is their accessibility, and I think that's what's going to keep them safe in the long run. Is that they, like if I was to say, let's go and survey otters, we'd be covering potentially vast areas of quite difficult terrain, whereas we can just get out the car, follow the paths, and they're right there beside us. So that's for me what makes them quite fascinating. So as I've said at the end there, good luck and come on the grassland water voles.